Rain hit the dorm windows like a metronome I couldn't silence. At the campus print kiosk, my card stuttered and failed. One more tap, another decline. When I opened the banking app, the number glared back. A handful of dollars where months of night shifts should have been. The ledger read like a stranger's wish list, all shipped to the address that used to mean home. I am Elin Parker, a senior who counts every swipe. The shipments didn't belong to me. The IP trails and delivery notes pointed somewhere familiar. The house where Louise Parker still keeps the porch light on, and where Dana Parker always swears she'll do better next week. I remembered the afternoon Dana borrowed my old laptop because hers was acting up, and how I dismissed the itch between my shoulders as paranoia. The truth landed without ceremony. My sister drained my bank account while I was at college. When I came home and found out, I said nothing. She laughed. But just 5 minutes later, the police arrived. Silence became my anchor. I forwarded statements, froze credit, logged recovery paths, and filed what Miss Finley at Legal Aid called an essential beginning. Officer Hayes confirmed a civil standby so no one could recast my caution as cruelty. Carter Vale reminded me to breathe between steps, but breath felt like a luxury. I wanted timestamps, not comfort. Seattle's sky dimmed to pewter as I wheeled my suitcase up the same driveway I learned to ride a bike on. The lock turned, the air smelled like new electronics, and the quiet part of me, the part that saves everything, clicked record. If you've ever had to protect your peace from people who share your last name, tell me how you did it in the comments. Seattle met me with the kind of rain that never stops, a quiet drizzle that feels more like breathing water than walking through it. The taxi turned onto our street, and through the blur of the windshield I saw the porch light glowing always on, like my mother still believed it meant safety. Inside, the air carried a scent I didn't remember. Something new, sharp, expensive. My suitcase wheels left faint trails on the entry rug. The living room shimmered with surfaces that hadn't existed last summer. Sleek glass, brushed metal, and a television so large it swallowed the wall. The cushions looked untouched, as if they'd been bought for display, not for comfort. The price tags might as well have been stamped across the screens of my eyelids. Every object whispered the same accusation. My savings had become decoration. Louise Parker, my mother, moved around the kitchen with that distracted energy she used whenever guilt hovered too close. She still wore her hair pinned the way she had when I was little, as though the style could freeze time and keep her mistakes somewhere in the past. She asked how school was, but her eyes drifted toward the new appliances instead of me. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The silence filled the room like fog rolling in from the sound. Then I heard laughter, bright, careless, familiar. Dana Parker, my sister, entered in a flurry of perfume and confidence. She carried a shopping bag in one hand and her phone in the other, documenting everything like her life was a series of trophies. Her energy vibrated against my restraint. She didn't notice me at first. Or maybe she did and simply didn't care. That indifference was its own confession. I walked past both of them, every movement measured. Upstairs, my old room waited the way abandoned places do, with dust at the edges and echoes that hadn't faded. I set my laptop on the desk, opened a secure browser, and began matching transactions. The pattern was simple, cruelly precise, each withdrawal aligned with the times Dana had visited. The shipping address remained unchanged, our home, her playground, my ruin. I stared at the figures until they blurred, until numbers became sound. Somewhere below, Dana's laughter rose again, muffled through the vents. It wasn't the noise that hurt, it was the ease of it. She existed inside the wreckage she made and still found room to laugh. I sent a message to Carter Vale, attaching the newest screenshots. He'd offered to help me document everything properly, said organization was half of justice. His reply came quick: don't confront, build the record. I understood. Words would give her warning. Evidence would take that from her. Downstairs, drawers opened and closed, the rhythm of someone living without consequence. My mother's voice floated up, soft and pleading. She'd always believed love meant tolerance, that silence could heal what it only hid. I wondered if she'd looked at those delivery boxes and chosen to believe they were mine if pretending ignorance had become easier than facing proof. The rain thickened outside, running in narrow veins across the window glass. I remembered the years we'd counted coins for groceries, how Dana had rolled her eyes while I folded receipts into neat stacks. She'd said I treated money like religion. Maybe she was right. Maybe saving had been my way of worshipping control in a family that never had any. Now the sanctuary had been desecrated, and the thief lived downstairs. I drafted an email to Miss Finley at Legal Aid. The subject line was a single word: proof. I attached bank statements, screenshots, purchase confirmations, and the IP log from my account. Each file felt like a heartbeat returning to its rightful body. When I hit send, something steadied in me. This wasn't revenge, it was restoration. I checked the clock past midnight. The glow from the streetlights cut through the blinds, painting narrow bars across my desk. Somewhere below, a cabinet door slammed, followed by Dana's laughter again, louder this time. I closed my laptop and let the dark stretch wide around me. In the morning, I'd walk the rain-soaked blocks to the legal aid office. I'd hand over evidence. I'd let systems, not fury, do the work. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burned out fast, precision didn't. Outside, thunder rolled like something final. Inside, my mother's voice trailed through the hallway, still pretending this was a home. I knew better. Homes aren't built from walls and shared names. They're built from trust, and ours had already collapsed. Seattle kept raining as if the sky itself refused to look away. The following days unfolded without shape, measured not by hours but by how often I refreshed a screen. The house around me hummed with casual life, drawers closing, footsteps crossing the hallway, the constant thud of rain against glass. Every sound carried a reminder that I was living beside the person who had dismantled my name and numbers. I woke earlier than anyone, when the street outside was only a gray smear. The silence before daylight suited me. I learned the rhythm of collecting proof, the quiet kind of work that required no confrontation. Each click of my trackpad became a sentence in the case I was building. I captured screenshots, saved delivery confirmations, traced IP addresses, and downloaded statements until my desktop looked like a courtroom floor, each file a fragment of accusation. Dana Parker had left traces everywhere. Her shopping patterns were careless, her passwords predictable. A string of orders bore the same timestamp as the nights she had gone out with friends. I located device IDs, browser histories, and matching coordinates that lined up perfectly with our home's Wi-Fi. The evidence wasn't dramatic, it was mathematical. Precision has a quiet violence that no argument can undo. I labeled folders with dates, though the days blurred into one long continuation of rain. Sometimes I heard Louise, my mother, moving through the hallway, pausing outside my door, then retreating. Her silence had texture dense, uneasy, like fabric too heavy to lift. I knew she suspected what I was doing, maybe even who I was doing it against, but she chose to protect stillness, not truth. At night, light from the city bled through the blinds. I stared at my reflection in the window and tried to locate the version of myself that still trusted proximity. It wasn't there anymore. Trust, once broken, doesn't echo, it disappears. I reached out to Carter Vale again, sending a compressed file of the updated documentation. He answered with precision. No excess words. Received, cataloged, ready when you are. There was comfort in the professionalism of it. He didn't ask why or how. He dealt in order, not empathy. It was what I needed, someone to treat the situation like data, not drama. Later that evening, I drafted a report for Miss Finley, attaching every compiled folder. Her instructions had been clear. Detail everything but keep emotion out of the document. I followed her guidance exactly. The irony wasn't lost on me. Removing feeling had become both legal strategy and survival tactic. Downstairs, Dana lived as if consequence were a myth. Packages still arrived, boxes stacked neatly at the front door. She posted pictures online, curated images of stability, captions about new beginnings. Watching her manufacture joy out of theft was its own education. People don't need forgiveness to thrive, they need an audience. I didn't speak to my mother. She didn't ask questions. The distance between us became architectural: 2 floors, 2 moral codes, 1 roof. Sometimes, when she thought I wasn't listening, she hummed the same tune she used when my father left. That melody used to mean comfort, now it only meant surrender. One afternoon, a notification blinked across my phone. Seattle Police Department, confirmation of civil standby appointment, Officer Hayes. The words glowed in bureaucratic calm, but I read them like a verdict. The time and date were set. The process had begun. From that moment, I adjusted everything around the plan. Files printed and sealed in plastic. Copies uploaded to cloud storage under encrypted names. I even photographed the serial number on my old laptop, the one Dana had borrowed. Nothing would be left uncertain. The next morning, she left early, perfume trailing behind her like a flag of arrogance. I walked into her room for the first time in years. It smelled of synthetic florals and electric heat. Her desk overflowed with receipts, unfiled papers, a half-empty coffee cup growing mold. I wasn't there to touch anything, only to document. The camera clicked once for every object that didn't belong to her income. Evidence doesn't need anger to be powerful. It only needs clarity. When I finished, I returned to my room and uploaded everything to the secure drive. The rain started again, steady and cold, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was background noise for discipline. That night, while the others slept, I backed up the final folder labeled Root. Inside it, I placed not just proof but intent, the quiet decision that there would be no turning back. Once the process began, it would end in exposure, not apology. Before shutting the laptop, I opened the calendar app. The civil standby with Officer Hayes glowed in pale blue. The digital square looked harmless, almost gentle. Yet inside that date sat the collapse of a family's illusion. I lay down without closing the curtains. The city outside was a constellation of anonymous windows, each one holding lives I didn't know. Somewhere within that expanse, justice waited, not the cinematic kind, but the slow, administrative justice that erases excuses one document at a time. When sleep finally came, it wasn't peace, it was preparation. Morning came without sunlight, just a thick layer of gray resting over the rooftops. The air was damp enough to taste, and the cold carried its own kind of silence. I wasn't awake from the alarm, I hadn't slept. The documents were printed, clipped, and sealed in their folder like a quiet confession waiting to be heard. Every movement felt rehearsed, as if I had practiced this day in some other life. I waited by the kitchen counter, tracing the edge of the marble with one finger. The hum of the refrigerator filled the stillness. There was no sound from upstairs yet, no evidence of Dana Parker or Louise. I wondered if guilt ever made them restless, if they had dreams shaped like invoices and screens. Probably not. Guilt only finds those who seek the truth, the rest keep sleeping. The knock came at exactly the time the email had promised. Firm, measured, 3 beats. It wasn't loud, but it carried authority, the sound of consequence arriving on schedule. When I opened the door, a flash of navy uniform met the dim morning light. Officer Hayes stood there, rain collecting on the brim of his cap, expression unreadable. Behind him, a marked car idled at the curb, the engine purring like a witness. Procedure doesn't require words. I stepped aside. The officer's boots left clean, deliberate prints across the floor as he entered. He carried the calm of someone who has seen too many scenes like this, where homes become evidence and family turns into paperwork. I handed him the folder. The gesture was small, but it felt like transferring weight. Upstairs, footsteps stirred. Dana's rhythm was always fast, always unbothered. She came down humming, her reflection still shining in the hallway mirror. She hadn't noticed the uniform yet. The moment her eyes caught the badge, everything inside her stilled. The silence between recognition and denial is microscopic, but you can feel it like the air holds its breath. Louise appeared a moment later, confusion already building behind her face. She looked between me, the officer, the folder in his hand. Realization crawled across her features, not sudden but slow, as if her mind rejected each piece before accepting the whole. I didn't move. My heart didn't race. My body had already learned the rhythm of control. Paperwork exchanged hands. Words were said official, procedural, detached. I didn't speak, not because I couldn't, but because nothing left to say would change the shape of what had already begun. The officer's tone remained neutral, efficient. He was trained to stay outside emotion, but the room itself carried enough tension to fill the gaps. Dana's expression fractured, shifting between disbelief and indignation. She turned toward me for the first time, but I refused to meet her eyes. Her face had once mirrored mine, familiar and safe. Now it was just a reflection. I didn't recognize a stranger with my history wearing it like a mask. I listened to the rain against the windows, steady and cold. Each drop seemed to mark time, counting seconds of a life dividing into before and after. Somewhere deep inside, something in me loosened, not joy, not satisfaction, just the release that follows truth spoken aloud. Louise tried to steady herself by gripping the back of a chair. She looked older, smaller. The exhaustion in her posture said more than apology ever could. I knew she'd believed silence was safety, that by avoiding conflict she was protecting what little peace remained. But silence had never been neutral. It was complicity dressed as calm. Officer Hayes reviewed the signatures, his pen moving without hesitation. I watched the ink spread into the paper, forming the shape of closure. The sound was faint, but it might as well have been thunder. Dana's breathing grew uneven. I could hear it even over the rain. She muttered something under her breath, a sound that was neither defense nor regret, just noise. When the officer finished, he turned slightly toward me, nodding once. The gesture carried an entire language. Acknowledgement, respect, finality. He gathered the documents, tucked them neatly into his case, and left as quietly as he had arrived. The door closed with a soft latch that echoed like punctuation. The house didn't feel like mine, but it no longer felt like theirs either. The air changed after he left, thinner, cleaner, unburdened. Dana stood frozen near the staircase, still processing the fracture. Louise sank into a chair, her eyes glassy, staring through me rather than at me. I didn't wait for words. They would only fill space that no longer needed explanation. I turned, walked upstairs, and closed my door with the same quiet precision I had used to open every file. Outside, the police car rolled away, its red and blue reflections sliding across the wet pavement until they disappeared. The rain kept falling. It always did. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and archived the folder labeled Proof Filed. The system chimed softly as the files vanished from the visible drive. There was nothing left to track. Nothing left to chase. Justice didn't feel victorious. It felt sterile, procedural, exact. And maybe that was its real mercy truth without noise. I looked out the window again. Somewhere below, the porch light flickered once before going dark. For the first time, the house stood in darkness, and it finally made sense. The day after the knock, the house settled into an unfamiliar quiet. It wasn't peace, it was absence. Every object seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone who no longer had permission to stay. The air had changed texture. It carried no warmth, only residue. I moved through rooms like an archivist cataloging the remains of a story that had ended mid-sentence. The living room, once crowded with noise, now felt staged. Coffee cups sat half full, a pair of shoes abandoned near the door, a jacket draped over the arm of the couch as if time had paused mid-action. But it hadn't paused, it had moved on, and it had left them behind. Dana Parker's room was open. She never left doors open. The space inside looked like a storm aftermath. Drawers half pulled, clothing scattered, a few valuables missing. The perfume still hung in the air, defiant and fading. There was no apology written on any surface, no note, no attempt to explain, only absence pretending to be an answer. Downstairs, Louise sat at the kitchen table, a figure carved out of stillness. Her eyes followed the grain of the wood instead of meeting mine. The woman who had once filled silence with optimism now used it as armor. I didn't speak. Words had already done their damage in the form of statements, signatures, and reports. Everything beyond that would be noise pretending to be closure. The phone rang once that afternoon. Unknown number. I let it ring until it stopped. Silence had become my only currency, and I wasn't ready to spend it. Outside, the neighborhood carried on, unaware that our walls had collapsed. Children biked through puddles, delivery vans passed by, and somewhere, music played from a car window. Life continued its routine indifference. Justice, it seemed, was quieter than I'd imagined. By evening, the light turned golden and brittle. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights blink awake one by one. The folder marked Proof Filed still sat on the desk, now irrelevant. The law had done its part. The investigation would move forward. The process would stretch into months. I had learned that justice doesn't rush. It documents. Dana hadn't been arrested that morning, but the process had started: the formal investigation, the financial holds, the legal summons. Her bank accounts would freeze. Her credit would rot. It wasn't cinematic, but it was precise. Real consequences are rarely loud. They echo slowly through systems that don't forgive errors in paperwork. Louise would face her own kind of reckoning. Her silence had been protection turned to complicity. The investigators would ask why she hadn't reported the withdrawals, why she hadn't intervened. There would be forms, interviews, explanations. No amount of maternal deflection could make bureaucracy merciful. I walked outside, the cold air biting gently at my face. The porch light, once eternal, remained off. I watched the faint reflections of my own breath rise and dissolve. The rain had stopped, but puddles held the memory of its small mirrors that refused to forget. Carter sent a message. Case acknowledged. Next steps pending review. I stared at the words longer than necessary. It was an ordinary update, but it carried finality. My part was done. I went for a walk without a destination. The streets were damp, shining under the dim light of passing cars. Each block looked the same: quiet houses, drawn curtains, the illusion of stability. Yet beneath every window, I imagined stories like mine, untold, unresolved, waiting for their own kind of knock. When I returned, Louise's car was gone. The keys still hung on the hook by the door, the emergency set I'd made when I was 17. She must have left with the other set, the one she always claimed she'd misplaced. There was no message, no explanation. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock, counting the seconds she no longer shared this space. The emptiness didn't frighten me. It clarified things. I cleaned the counters, folded a blanket, threw away the spoiled milk in the fridge. Ordinary acts of maintenance, but they felt like rituals, ways to reclaim space through repetition. Revenge had burned hot once. Now it cooled into responsibility. I turned off every light except one by the stairway. The glow touched the edges of the hallway pictures, faces frozen in older happiness. I took them down, one by one, stacking the frames neatly in a box. Letting go isn't erasure, it's redefinition. When I reached my room, I sat at the desk again. The screen lit up with the reflection of someone I barely recognized. The version of myself who'd arrived home weeks ago, desperate and exhausted, no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had learned that truth doesn't need revenge, it only needs endurance. The legal process would continue on its own path, indifferent and exact. Dana's actions would follow her into every form she signed, every background check, every reminder that trust, once broken, is a permanent record. And maybe that was enough. I closed the laptop and leaned back, letting the quiet stretch until it felt natural again. For the first time in months, I didn't need to plan anything. I didn't need to gather proof or anticipate betrayal. I only needed to exist within the silence I had earned. Outside, the street was empty. The rain began again, soft, insistent, cleansing. I let it fall without resistance. Mornings arrived differently now. The stillness that once felt oppressive had softened into something almost gentle. The house no longer echoed with footsteps or conversation, only the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, the hum of the heater, the soft click of pipes expanding with warmth. It wasn't comfort, but it was order, and order had become my only form of peace. I began to rebuild my days with precision, as though structure could substitute for healing. Every morning, I brewed coffee and sat by the same window, watching condensation form and fade on the glass. The ritual wasn't about enjoyment, it was a declaration. The world still existed outside, and I still had a place within it. The legal process continued in its distant, mechanical way. Letters arrived with official seals, names printed in serif fonts that felt detached from the people they represented. Dana Parker's case moved through systems and signatures. I never attended hearings, I didn't need to. Justice, once set in motion, didn't require witnesses. It required endurance. Some nights, I imagined her in another apartment, bare, unfamiliar, stripped of the comfort she once took from deception. I didn't wish her suffering. I only wished her awareness. Consequence without understanding is meaningless. Louise had sent one letter weeks after leaving. The envelope was thin, the handwriting careful, the message brief. I hope you find peace. I didn't know how to protect both of you. There was no return address, no invitation to reply. I didn't. Some bridges don't burn, they dissolve. Work became my next form of control. I returned to my consulting job at the small firm downtown. The office smelled of paper and recycled air, comfortingly neutral. My coworkers treated me as they always had, polite distance, quiet professionalism. No one asked about my absence, and I offered no explanations. In a world obsessed with transparency, silence remains the last act of privacy. In the evenings, I walked through the neighborhood alone. The trees had begun to shed, their branches tracing faint outlines against the pale sky. I counted the rhythm of my steps, aligning breath with movement. There was something therapeutic in the simplicity of repetition. Control doesn't always mean domination. Sometimes it means survival through steadiness. I passed the small bakery at the corner where I used to meet Dana for coffee. It was under new management now. The window displays had changed, different pastries, different handwriting on the chalkboard. The past had quietly rewritten itself. Memory doesn't vanish. It mutates until it fits the space left behind. At home, I kept everything minimal. One plate, one cup, one set of utensils. Each item had purpose, each decision intention. Clutter invited chaos, and I had learned how easily chaos masquerades as comfort. Occasionally, I received updates from Cartervale, concise, methodical. Funds recovered, final audit scheduled, restitution pending. His emails read like instructions, detached but efficient. I appreciated the clarity. Compassion, at that stage, would have been interference. It was around this time that I began writing, not for confession, but for containment. Every evening, I filled a few pages in a plain notebook. No dates, no names, just fragments of thought. Anger without target is noise. Forgiveness without accountability is vanity. The words anchored me, even when meaning slipped away. Writing didn't heal, but it mapped the scar. Months passed quietly, measured by the slow transition of seasons. The rain became snow, and the light through my window turned sharp and pale. With every passing week, I felt less like a victim and more like a record keeper, someone tasked with preserving truth, not reliving it. Then one morning, while sorting through old files, I found the last envelope from Miss Finley, my lawyer. It contained the final report, the case closed, restitution processed, the formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The words were clinical, the tone unemotional. Yet for the first time I felt something unfamiliar, an absence of tension. It wasn't triumph. It was the quiet understanding that I no longer needed to fight. That night, I went to the pier. The air smelled of salt and electricity, the horizon folding into mist. The city lights shimmered across the water, distant and unbothered. I stood there for a long time, letting the cold reach through my coat. For months, I had lived in pursuit of equilibrium, mistaking stillness for peace. But peace isn't the absence of noise, it's the acceptance of silence. I closed my eyes and thought of the girl I used to be before all of this, the one who trusted, who believed loyalty was a currency without expiration. She no longer existed, but she had been necessary. Without her, there would be no me to stand here now, steady and awake. On the walk home, snow began to fall, erasing footprints before they could form. It felt like permission. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, just the acknowledgement that moving forward doesn't require resolution, only momentum. When I returned, I placed the final report in a drawer and locked it. I didn't need to see it again. Truth had already done its work. Keeping it visible would only turn victory into obsession. I poured a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the streetlights glow against the snowfall. Somewhere in the distance, a siren passed, fading quickly into the night. The world was still imperfect, still indifferent, but for once, it wasn't against me. Peace had come at a cost: trust, family, illusion, but it had come nonetheless. And in that moment, sitting in the half-light of an empty house, I realized that revenge had never been the ending. It had been the method by which I reclaimed myself. The city felt different when spring came, not brighter, but honest. The air carried a kind of clarity that revealed rather than concealed. Streets no longer seemed hostile. They were just indifferent, as they had always been. It was I who had changed, not the world. I moved into a small apartment near the edge of downtown. The view wasn't impressive, a narrow slice of sky framed by brick buildings, but it was mine. There were no traces of anyone else's history, no echoes of voices I had to forget. I filled the space slowly, intentionally, as though I were learning the art of belonging again. One chair, one bookshelf, one plant by the window. Life reduced to essentials, and essentials began to feel abundant. Each morning I walked to the river before sunrise. The bridge loomed quiet, steel bones catching the first light. The water moved beneath it steady, indifferent to everything built above. I watched it flow, thinking about how time carries away what refuses to let go. It doesn't erase. It simply keeps moving until you learn to move with it. My reflection on the surface was faint but present. I no longer searched for recognition in it. I didn't need to reconcile who I was before with who I had become. The past had its place. It no longer demanded a seat at my table. The legal closure had come weeks earlier, emails confirming final restitution, the digital equivalent of a signature on silence. Dana Parker was listed as non-compliant, her debts transferred to state collections. It was impersonal, bureaucratic, absolute. I didn't feel triumph or regret, just distance. Some endings aren't fireworks. They're the quiet closing of a file. Louise never contacted me again. Sometimes, when I passed an older woman at the market or the train station, I wondered if she thought of me, but the wondering ended quickly. I had learned that forgiveness and absence aren't opposites. Sometimes, walking away is the most merciful form of closure. Work consumed my days now, not as distraction, but as creation. I joined a new project at the firm, advising on systems of trust and accountability. Irony followed me like a shadow, but I didn't mind. The same precision that once built walls now built structure. Stability became my rebellion. Weekends were quieter. I spent them writing, still no longer about anger or betrayal, but about cause and consequence. I wrote for the sake of clarity, not confession. Each page became evidence of something softer than revenge, understanding. I never shared those pages with anyone. Some truths aren't meant for an audience, they're meant for their author. One afternoon, I received a letter addressed in a formal hand. The seal read State of Illinois, but it wasn't legal. Inside was a short note from Carter Vale. Case fully resolved. No further obligations. Recommendation for financial restitution enacted. Below that, a single line in smaller handwriting. You did everything right. Most people never get to that point. I placed the letter in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a record of completion. Right didn't mean perfect, it meant finished. There was a kind of dignity in knowing when a story no longer required your participation. The apartment became my sanctuary for silence. Evenings were spent with the hum of the city outside my window, a low chorus of cars, wind, and distant conversations. Life went on, and I let it. I no longer measured time by loss or victory. It moved, and I followed. Sometimes, when I lay awake, I thought about the girl who had returned home months ago to find her bank account emptied, her trust stolen. She had believed that revenge would restore what was taken. She was wrong. It hadn't restored, it had rebuilt. Revenge wasn't about destruction, it was about reclamation. The act of taking back control, not of others, but of oneself. Peace, I realized, doesn't come when the pain ends. It comes when the pain no longer dictates the terms of your life. That was the cost of peace, not forgetting, but learning how to live with memory without letting it rule. The final distance between who I was and who I became wasn't measured in miles or months, it was measured in stillness. The ability to exist without explanation. The choice to live without needing anyone to understand. I stopped expecting apologies. I stopped waiting for validation. Justice had already been served, the rest was choice. People often confuse closure with reconciliation. But closure is private, it belongs to the one who survived. That night, I went to the river again. The bridge stood the same, but the water looked clearer. The sky had opened just enough to let through a narrow band of gold. I watched the light ripple across the current, its motion continuous and unbothered. For the first time, I didn't think about what I had lost. I thought about what I had protected, the part of me that refused to become like them. I turned away from the water not as a goodbye, but as acknowledgement. Some chapters don't end, they simply stop needing to be read. Back at home, I opened my notebook and wrote the final entry. Healing isn't a return, it's a reconstruction. Some family ties aren't broken, they're unlearned. And peace isn't something you find, it's something you choose over and over, until it becomes part of who you are. I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf beside the window. The evening light fell over it softly, the way endings do when they no longer hurt.